Welcome to our Chinmaya Setukari West Wellness Workshop. This will be our 6th. I'm appreciative of how steady our team has been, all of you have been, and how this steadiness is leading to objective and subjective growth. Our workshop today, the subject is perspectives on the end of life. I'm going to share the perspective of our Shastra, specifically Srimad Bhagavatam. And this will be the lead-in to listening to Megha share from her sacred and secular positioning. Raja Chitraketu was married. He had 3 wives. He and his wives together were unable to have any children. And this bothered them a lot. Their Kula Guru, their family guide, his name, Rishi Angiras. When Rishi Angiras happened to be in their home, he was asking, "How are you?" And Raja Chitraketu couldn't hide his sadness. And Raja Chitraketu shared, "We just want to have a child." And Rishi Angiras said, "I can facilitate this. Your child will be the source of joy and sorrow in your life." All Raja Chitraketu heard was, "will be the source of joy in your life." Shortly after, with Rishi Angiras's grace, the senior-most Rani, she had a baby. And she was delighted. And Raja Chitraketu was delighted. The whole kingdom was delighted. But soon, the other 2 junior Ranis became jealous that the other Rani is receiving more attention. She's going to separate herself as the queen. And so what these 2 Ranis did is they colluded and they actually poisoned this infant, and this infant died. When the gathering was happening to express their sorrow, Raja Chitraketu, the Ranis, the people of the kingdom were all crying. And Rishi Angiras came back. And he also came with Rishi Narada. And Raja Chitraketu, out of his sadness, asked Rishi Angiras, "Why did you allow this to happen?" And Rishi Angiras shared, "I told you that your child will be the source of joy and sorrow. But you never heard me. You never listened to me." Raja Chitraketu can't bear this. And he wants to talk to his son one last time. So he looks to Rishi Narada and says, help me have this dialogue." And Rishi Narada, out of his compassion, is able to pull out the subtle body, the personality, the mind, from that infant that's wrapped up in cloth. And when that personality emerges, Raja Chitraketu asks that subtle body, "Why did you leave us? Where are you going?" I'm your father. You're supposed to be here with me. And that personality, that subtle body says, which father? Which father are you? I've been coming and going for millions of lifetimes with millions of parents. Which one are you? This simple statement from this subtle body really leveled Raja Chitraketu, the Ranis. They all came to appreciate the present lifetime is a lifetime. It is not the lifetime. We are forever coming and going. Based on this insight, if one can internalize this, we are all born to realize we are more than this body. And once we realize all that we can in a body, then this body has served its purpose. And we graduate and we move on to another body to realize we're more than that body, to finally realize we are the spirit or Brahman. So the end of life, this is the end of a lifetime. This is not the end of life. These insights are what help us most in not succumbing to grief. Bhagavan Krishna tells Prince Arjuna, the wise do not grieve, for the living nor the dead. And he goes on to share insights on why being born and dying is part of a lifetime. This is not life, though. Our presenter today is Megha. And Megha is originally from Chicago, and she is moving all over the place. Seattle, now in San Francisco. I've known Megha for a long time, and anytime you need help, she is ever ready to help. Whether it's facilitating a Siddhagari workshop or teaching a kids class, she and I have served together in many opportunities. She and I actually spoke together at the VA in Seattle on a similar subject. And what I was most appreciative of, seeing Megha interact with her fellow physicians and administrators, is how much they liked and loved Megha. And you're going to feel the same as she now shares her thoughts on perspectives on the end of life. Thank you, Megha. You can unmute yourself. I'll mute myself.
Hari Om, everyone. Thank you so much, Vivekji, for this opportunity to share my experiences on the end of life time. Can everyone hear me? Just give me a thumbs up so I can see. Great. And I'll go ahead and share my screen. Let's see here. Okay. Okay, great. Okay, so this topic is really important to me because I realized as a doctor, as I trained, I found that as I trained alongside thinking about Vedanta, end of life was the most appropriate means for me to apply what I learned in Vedanta to my work as a doctor. So thank you so much for allowing me to share my thoughts. And I'm also hoping that we can learn from each other, and towards the end of this time, we'll break out into groups as well. Special shout out to Seattle, Chicago, and San Jose, and thank you so much for allowing me to think about my work in the context of our scriptures. All right, so I'm gonna first begin with the perspective of healthcare, then transition to what I think is really important in approaching the end of life through values. Then we'll have our breakout groups, and I hope that everyone can share with each other if they feel so. and that we can learn from each other as well. And then we'll end with questions. First, I'll have everyone close your eyes, take a deep breath in, and breathe out. And with this breath, know that you've entered a protected space in which we're going to talk about a really challenging topic. If you feel like you need to pause, that's totally cool. Just take a step back and jump right back in when you feel like you can, and we'll be right here. I'm hoping that by the end, we can approach death with a sense of peace. First, I'll have everyone individually reflect. So if you have a piece of paper in front of you, or if you don't, you can just think about it. Write down a few words about what you want your death to look like. So this is pretty intense to think about your own death. So I've just put a few examples. Maybe it's really important for you to be surrounded by your family. Maybe you just want to be passed really quickly, or you want to be surrounded by the trees and mountains that you love so much. Maybe you just want to be happily unaware and not really know where you are or who you are. Maybe you want to be sleeping or meditating, or you find a lot of joy in singing, or perhaps you want to feel like you have tried your level best to prolong your life, and this is inside the hospital. So just take some time to think about what you want your death to look like. Okay, great. And then thinking about what you want your death to look like, I want us now to reflect as a group and really think about what values drive how we feel our ideal end-of-life experience should be. So this might mean values of family, of peace, joy, persistence. So go ahead and write in the chat room, type in the chat room, what values you feel drive what you just thought about. And I'm unable to actually open the chat. I'm not sure. Let's see. Okay, well, regardless, what I want you to think about here is the idea of that death is not inherently a bad thing. When we refocus on values, we can see how those values drive our life and how that can then inform the end of that time. And also the idea that there can be such thing as a good death. So now I'm going to talk about how oftentimes we typically think of death from the perspective of healthcare. Oh, here we go. I can see the chat now. Okay. Little burden, happiness, peace, oneness, wonderful. Okay, so we have, if you can all see the whiteboard here, we typically see and focus on disease and how it can be fixed, or we have this focus on cure. So if we represent this graphically, you might see something like this, where we start here with birth and end here with death. And on the x-axis is time. And we might come up and as we progress in life and then regress towards the end. Or it might look something more like this, where we have lots of ups and downs throughout life, but still we end in death. And so the big question is here, when we see birth as it progresses to death in a particular time frame, the question is, what do we value here? What is going up and down? So go ahead and type in the chat room, what do you think is on the y-axis here? Happiness, I see, functionality, well-being, physical health, ability to give, joy, health, productivity, life, material success, life events, health, great, happiness and peace, joy, minds up and down, great, quality of life, fulfillment, independence, awesome. So when we think about all of those things on the y-axis here, it makes us question, do we really feel like birth and death have the lowest sense of, let's say, values or fulfillment? Or is there another way we can see life and death? Oftentimes we focus on the end of life and we focus on that cure, trying to slow down the progression of this downward slope. But if we take, let's say, a specific moment in time, and we really focus on this time and see what values are important to us during that time, because it might change over our life. And think about how those values then inform how we want our end of life experience to be. In this way, instead of a linear form, we can then see life and death as a part of the same circle, with our values being the center of it. And when we think about life and death on the same spectrum, we can really root ourselves in using our values to drive how we live our life, and that will then take us to how we experience the end of life as well. This reminds me of a patient that I took care of in Seattle who is originally from Fiji, and he was going in and out of the hospital a lot with infections in his lungs. He had a large family who would always come in, and we were trying a lot to help him with his lungs, and it just was not working as well. Finally, once we actually took the time to sit down with him and sit down with his family, and all together we talked about what he valued most. And we learned he simply wanted to spend time with his family and drink his chai. And this whole time we were telling him, don't drink any chai, it'll cause you to cough and you might choke. And then that's not good for your lungs. And we were enforcing our values of cure onto him when he had a different approach. He wanted to focus more on quality of life. And finally, we were able to do that. We were able to allow him to drink his chai, be with his family. And if that meant that his life was not prolonged as much, that was okay with him. So in thinking about focusing on values, I think this is especially important now when we have our public health crisis with COVID. And we're challenged by our ethics and how we think of what end of life should look like. And so I think when we come back to values, we can really see how that can drive some of these more challenging ethical questions. So using that value-based framework instead, we can then see end of life in a big tree where we have different roots. So often we think of end of life and death specifically in the physical realm, when it's actually rooted in psychological, spiritual, and social realms as well. In thinking about psychological, there might be fear or uncertainty. I know that when I first saw someone pass away, I was, I think, like 15, and I cried. And those of you who know me well know that I never cry. And I found that I was just confused at what I was experiencing. And so that kind of fear and uncertainty is a huge part of how we all experience end of life. Of course, there's a spiritual realm, which we'll delve into more in a bit, and social as well. We might think of important networks like our family and friends in this aspect. Spiritually, Vedanta teaches us that we are not the body, that we are beyond birth and death. And thinking about that, we are the ever-free witness of all of those things, of birth, life, death, lifetime. And so I have found that in my work, as I take care of patients and really help families and patients learn about their own values, that this idea of witness or sakshi is a really big part of how I practice. And I think that we can take this framework and really apply it to ourselves when we think about the end of life of ourselves and our family. So thinking about the important aspects of what it means to be the ever-free witness, it's important to sit, ask, know, share, hear, and introspect. When we sit and reflect on values, we think about what's important to us, and this takes time. It takes time to sit with ourselves and to sit with each other. And then once we do that, we can ask, how do these values inform our choices that we think are important to us at the end? It's important to know what to expect. When I have taken care of patients at the end of life, it has been helpful for me to explain to their families that they might expect changes in breathing, or to know how to cope and what to expect afterwards in terms of grief. Here, it's important to note that physicians and in healthcare, we are not able to predict death. This is something that is uncertain for everyone, yet is going to happen to everyone. So in that paradox, it's important to think about being comfortable with uncertainty. Sharing stories in life can really help us think and be thankful for who we have around us. And when we really ask, people have crazy stories. It's really cool to ask and learn about what our mom and dad experienced at our age, and really delve into the lifetime that they've had that's been so great. Thinking about how that can make us more thankful, that can then help us ease the grief at the end of life. Hearing and really hearing deeply is an important part of validating existence. Finally, this leads to introspect, to look inside and know that the answer is there, as our scriptures have always taught us. When I have taken care of patients at the end of life, I often find that when we sit with them and really ask and hear them, they feel validated, and if and when they pass, I feel like I have done a good job in hearing them. And when we do that, we actually see that spark of life that is common between us. We can find a lot of reassurance from our scriptures. So there's just a few listed there for your casual reading. And then a few on the right side as well, more practical resources in the healthcare field. And specifically looking at the fields of palliative care, which is used for patients with any chronic disease, not just end of life. And then hospice, which is specifically for end-of-life care. Most hospitals have chaplains, and even though we typically think of them as following the Abrahamic faiths, they're often trained in a way that's like non-denominational, and so they can be helpful as well. Of course, we have our own as well, which we can pull on for support. Advanced care planning, social work, and grief support groups are also other really fantastic resources. Okay, so I'll end with one of our prayers that we chant all the time. I'm hoping that this discussion was helpful for everyone. I know for me, it was really great to hear so many thoughtful insights. And with that, I pray that we are led from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, and from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions. You can probably type it in the chat room would be best.
Questions have started in the chat room already for Megha. We'll finish with our prayer by chanting Om 3 times, and then again, anyone who has questions, please stay on. She's the right person with the right perspective to answer these tough questions. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Be well.
Okay, Hari Om, everyone. Okay, so a couple of questions here. What about mentioning in the living will what medical choices one needs so it avoids the scenario 2? Yeah, yes, it's definitely helpful to talk about it in advance. So we have this idea of advanced care planning that really guides us in what choices our loved ones might have to make for us if we're not able to speak up for ourselves. The reality is that it doesn't always happen that way. Oftentimes there are choices that you don't even know you have to make. You might have to think about, do you have a feeding tube or not? Do you give people antibiotics or not? Do you give them meds that will maybe prolong their life but actually make them more uncomfortable? And then the other thing is, if this happens at a young age, it's very common that most people at a young age or old age are not talking about this. So what I would encourage everyone in this case is really, again, going back to values, and you can glean that from people's actions. People say things like, oh, like I would never want to be like stuck as a vegetable, or, we might say these things just like one off, but we can learn from experiences like that. We can learn from from experiences of specifically in our case, this idea that we are beyond birth and death. And so I encourage people to think about things, again, in a value-based approach, but know that you can plan, and planning is really important, but a lot of times we're faced with choices that we didn't even know we had to make. Okay, so then a question about what is palliative care. So apologies for not explaining this in detail, but palliative care is a branch of medicine that approaches chronic disease in a way that is holistic. Oftentimes, people think of this as simply treating symptoms, treating pain, treating hard time breathing, treating too many secretions, but it's not just that. There is so much more, as we all know, to the end of life that involves more mental health, that might invoke more spiritual health, that we think of as how to gain social support during these hard times. So palliative care specialists can help kind of bring all of those roots of that end of life tree together in thinking about how people live with a chronic disease. So, if you're ever in this case, then and you're not sure if palliative care specialists are an option, they probably are, and you can ask. You can just ask for it. Okay. So then, does grief sometimes manifest as anger towards a person who is dying or deceased? I have definitely seen that. I think the example that I'm thinking of is someone whose parent passed away, and that particular parent did not take care of himself, and didn't go to the doctor, and so this person felt a lot of anger, like how could you do this to yourself? And then probably more insightfully, how could you do this to us? Like, how could you not take care of yourself? Because that affects our own life as well as your family. And so we definitely see grief sometimes manifesting as anger as well. And I think what can be helpful here, it's hard because when you're in that situation, it's easy to be just overwhelmed with so many emotions, with anger, guilt, grief. And that's why I feel like the idea of being that ever-free witness is the most important. We have this idea in our scriptures which teach us that when we witness everything, we see it from a perspective that is all encompassing. And so I think sometimes we think of this as, it's really this idea that it's like unattached or it's like impersonal. And those words are definitely used in the scriptures, at least as it's translated in English. But I think we often attach negative emotions to this idea of being unattached. And so what I would encourage you to think about is this idea of witness as all encompassing and detached from the world, but attached to the highest divine. And that is the same in you and me and everyone. And so when we think about it like that, it's much more palatable to think of witness in this case. And then we can know that our loved one who has passed, even their most divine light is beyond birth and death. It's not easy. Okay. Let's see here.
There are also some questions that are coming in with people raising their hands. So if,
okay.
I think Poonam has one. So if you do want
Sure. Go ahead. Yeah. I think you can unmute yourself, Poonam.
And for everyone else, if you do have questions, you can raise your hand virtually. If you go at the bottom of your screen, there's an participants button. And if you click that on the right-hand side, you should see an option for unmuting yourself. For raising your hand. And we'll unmute you one by one. So Poonam, you're unmuted.
Thank you, Riom. Very nice discussion, Megha ji. And I don't know if this is something that's relevant for you to discuss, but I was wondering, how do you, like for someone who has experienced death of a child by suicide, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's really challenging, and thank you for that. This is a really hard thing to think about, why people end their own life. When I have sat on different lectures by various Swamijis and Swaminis, what what I have gleaned is this idea that everyone goes through what they need to go through. It's a really hard pill to swallow. I face this a lot when I mean, in so many cases that are hard, right? Like if you see like treating people who are homeless or going through abuse, or a lot of these like really intense experiences that people have, it's really hard to understand how can that be something that they have to deal with. And what's been helpful for me is bhakti. I am not able to reason through it as well. And so having that faith in the Lord that that patient is going through what they are meant to go through, but then also that you are there to support them in whatever way you can. Sometimes I think like, oh, if we're not the body, then what's my job as a physician? But I think what I have been told is, just as it is their prarabdha to go through this kind of pain, it is yours to then help them. So that's how I think about it. But I take care of adults, and I'm curious if any of the pediatricians in the room have any other thoughts about this, since I don't take care of kids. Maybe, I believe you can all unmute yourself, but if, so if there's any pediatrician or like child psychiatrist or anyone else who has better insights into this, that would be great.
Hariom, Megha, I think you're amazing. And I think everything you've stated is universal for all age groups. As a pediatric physical therapist, I have seen a case of a child who ran out into the street and was hit by a car and did not make it. That cannot be equated to suicide, but in the trainings that we have to do with age 0 to 18, suicide is a topic that comes up frequently, unfortunately. And I think addressing the question about how to cope with that is to realize that the choices that are made by this temporary body and mind are exactly that. They're temporary, but the light within each person has a much grander and infinite destiny. And as difficult as it is to think that jiva, that temporary home is no longer housing that soul, I find it helpful to look for reminders in the world around of where the essence of that child has been reborn. Because certainly everything which is born dies, but everything which dies is reborn. So in asking similar question to Swamiji's and Swamini's, I've been told to look for examples in nature, or in, if that child perhaps loved to giggle spontaneously, look for that essence in other children, and realize that those qualities and that essence will always shine through, even if it's not in that particular form and name.
Thank you so much for that. That's super helpful. Another question I'm seeing here: any advice on balancing sense of duty to care for a parent in the same loving way they cared for you your entire life, without feeling overwhelmed and considering practicalities with each unique situation? Yeah, really challenging. I think on a practical level, what can be really helpful is simply figuring out what sources of support you have with your insurance. And I know that sounds like just really like very like practical and logistic, but I think it's helpful because there are ways that can be helpful to us and our parent that we may not think about. So there's stuff like home health aid. I think a lot of times people think of, oh, I don't want to have to send my parent to a home where, you know, they're not with me. So know that that's an option, and that it is totally valid for you to take that time off for yourself and do your thing. If you need to work because that keeps you having a sense of balance, that's really crucial, because it goes back to this idea that if you can't care for yourself, then you will not care for your parent. And so prioritizing yourself, it feels selfish, but it's actually the same goal. And so thinking about it in that sense of, oh, we're working together as a team. The other thing is getting to know your parents in that way. I think when in cases where I've seen the idea of caregiving be really challenging is when there's just a lot of resentment and anger. And I think where it's helpful is when we can just, again, sit and hear each other out, hear each other's stories. That way we can reestablish this connection, and then giving care won't be as hard because you will feel compelled to with love. Okay, so then, so again, the importance of validation and then feeling grateful for them. And then going back to pediatrics, maybe if Shilpa, can you comment on the third scenario, specifically if a child asks, am I going to die? How does one respond to that?
Can I unmute myself? Oh, okay, great. So in pediatrics, in terms of training, we're often taught to make sure that we really listen to what the child feels about death and what they conceive as death. And as some of us talked about in the discussion group too, what a 3-year-old might perceive as death is very different to how we're thinking about death as an adult. So it goes back to your point, Megha, about validation, that validate that yes, death is going to occur, it's inevitable, but in this lifetime now, what can we do and how can we value what you think is the most important? And so in terms of guiding that aspect as a child, really understanding where they're coming from in terms of death, what they're the most afraid of or what they're the most anxious about, and really reframing that in a way that both the parent and child can experience together.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, sometimes the Vedanta rebirth, body dying, Atman living, etc. makes me feel uncompassionate, or people of other religions perceive me as uncompassionate. Any advice or thoughts? Yeah, definitely. It can seem really jarring. And I remember when I was sitting in a meeting with the hospital team discussing a patient with social work and palliative care. And I think we had like the hospital chaplain there too. And I was trying to bring up these ideas of like, oh, we're beyond birth and death and, you know, eternal life, and nobody was understanding it. And so I think what's been helpful to me is to again go back to the idea of Sakshi. And again, not that it's this idea that we are totally detached from everyone else's emotions and that we don't tune into those, but that by actually tuning into them and sitting with people and learning about them, we are validating their existence. And if we think of that as existence as Sat, then we are validating the divine. And there's nothing more Vedantic than that. And so I think we can see this idea of being a witness, not as like, oh, I'm not gonna care, but more as that I care so much because it's all encompassing, that I'm not gonna focus on the weakness of things like how like being sad can bring you down, but more so how being sad can actually uplift you, because you realize, okay, the body is going to die. It has restrictions in and of itself, but there is something beyond that, and that encompasses the body itself. I think, you know, what helps me here is we think of like in chapter 11, we see you know, God opens his mouth and we see everything, good, bad, things that are terrifying. And if we can appreciate the divinity in what we think of as good and bad, then we won't think of them as relatively good and bad anymore, and we will only think of them as ultimate capital G good. This is hard. I think it's helpful to use similar vocabulary as other faiths. So in Christianity, we might refer to eternal life. I think that's a really similar concept for us. I'm not super familiar with other faiths to know, but I think that would be one approach. Okay, great. Thank you so much once again for sitting and listening and contributing to a really challenging topic. I'm impressed that so many people were here and able to share your insights with everyone else. Thank you so much.